Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 134 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Will Porter will be joining me on today's episode, but I got a couple of housekeeping notes to get to first. The first is some cool news, and that is the show is now on Stitcher, so any of you that have maybe been listening online and are ready to switch over to a podcaster, I'm on that one. If there's any other kind of casting, whatever apps that you want me to put the show on, just message that along and I could get that up there. The other note is that Monday will be December 25th, and that is Christmas, so I will not have a show, but I'll be back with the show next Wednesday, and then next Friday will likely be the 2017 wrap-up show. Today's show, I think, is going to be a big one and a very important one, and what me and Will did is went through Trump's national security statement. So let's go ahead and introduce Will, then we'll get into the content. Will, how are you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. Thank you for having me on the show again.
Yeah, no problem. Will Porter is a journalist and a freelance writer who analyzes foreign policy news, mostly Middle East affairs stuff. His work can be found at libertarianinstitute.org, just like you could find the show there, and also on antiwar.com. Will Porter is also a recent guest on the Scott Horton Show, so very happy to add that credential to his introduction.
Yeah, me too.
All right, Will, so we got this massive document here. I believe I was looking at Moon of Alabama reacting and pointing out how this thing was almost twice as long as Obama's NSS.
Yeah, it's pretty long. It's like, 58 pages or so?
Yeah, I think 55 pages and then a couple pages of additional foreword by Trump and maybe an introduction too. So it was a lot to get through. And let's start there with Trump's foreword. Do you have any thoughts on, what we get from actual writing out of Donald Trump?
Yeah, sure. I didn't do any grammatical critique or anything or any stylistic critique, but the basic content of Trump's foreword is he actually kind of starts it out by painting like a very dark picture of the world. And it's sort of trying to set the stage for himself just to say, like, look at what I'm fixing or look at what I've already fixed. However, within the third paragraph of Trump's foreword, he's already hitting on like the themes that'll kind of ride out for the rest of the document. And that would be that America's fate is challenging terrorist, rogue regimes, and nuclear powers. And so already by the third paragraph, like you can tell where this thing's going on the foreign policy front. And an interesting thing to note too is that Trump uses the phrase "peace through strength," and that phrase is used throughout this document a lot. And I think it kind of defines the spirit of the document: peace through strength. But as a commentator named Andrew Basovich has pointed out, peace through strength can quite easily become peace through war. And so I think peace through war kind of sets the tone for the rest of the document in this foreword.
Yeah, that was a really significant part of the document itself. As you point out, I think it's actually one of the subheadings of the document is like number 3, preserve peace through strength.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought the foreword was interesting because it was the most heavily kind of centered America first. While the other part of the document itself talks about America first, this seems to be more of the campaignish America first, whereas the document will later get into America first really just means Americans could do whatever they want anywhere around the globe. So I thought that part was interesting. This is apparently probably the only part that Trump is actually signing his name to and read the whole thing of. White House official interviewed on the issue was unwilling to say that Trump had read the whole national security statement. And it definitely didn't sound like he had read it in whole from top to bottom. So while this is likely going to heavily influence Trump's foreign policy, it's not necessarily something that he has put a whole lot of attention into.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's kind of, it's a little frustrating that, we read the thing from cover to cover and the president doesn't. It's a little irksome.
Right. And so from Trump's forward, we now have an introduction, and this is getting into the actual document itself. The introduction is a few pages long, and it really attempts to describe what maybe the situation is like in the world. So, Will, why don't you kind of explain to us what we got here?
Sure, yeah. And in the introduction, like you have Trump's foreword, he kind of is like writing his own comments about the document. But the introduction of the document itself really gets into like ideological and worldview kind of things, broader worldview. And the intro itself starts with all this lip service to the Constitution and kind of, in a very rudimentary, like simplistic way, explains why we have a Constitution in the first place, which is kind of a little cute. that it tries to do that. But then very soon after, it gets very messianic and starts explaining how America is the greatest force for good in history. And it starts talking about the post-World War II international order. And this is where it really kind of gets into, I don't know how much this actually reflects Trump's personal worldview, but it certainly is reflecting some kind of worldview, some kind of ideological view. And so it basically says that America defeated all these forces for evil, imperialism and Nazism, and after World War II that we established this great international liberal order. And it's a little odd because Trump himself during his campaign kind of made himself out to be a disruptor and a challenger of that order, but here's the administration just praising it to high heaven. And it even explicitly mentions NATO, which Trump, very harshly criticized during his campaign. And so we can see it's a very clear break from the kind of campaign rhetoric that he was doing during the election. Now it's sort of back to the, traditional liberal world order that we have to protect from our foes and our enemies. But I think the common thread throughout the whole document that starts in the intro is basically where it says we've grown complacent. We set up this great international order after World War II, and now we're kind of getting soft and complacent, and our enemies are, attacking that world order and trying to undermine it. And so it kind of says, how do we fix this? It's time to fix this the situation. And how do we do it? Why? By doing all the same stuff that we've been doing all along, of course. And that's kind of what the document itself lays out as it goes.
Absolutely. And I guess one part that I found most interesting that I didn't catch when I read it was the praise for the world order that Trump kind of stood against as a candidate. Trump was very America first, we don't need this UN, even questioned America's need to be in NATO. And as you said, here we have this document really praising that world order. I would just go a little bit more into the introduction, and that it just seems so mystical to me. It read almost like the setting for the Lord of the Rings. Where you have this situation where America, fought the enemies of evil during the World War II, and then we kept them at bay during the Cold War, but now we've grown complacent and evil has reemerged in the world. And now, the great hero Donald Trump sets out on and embarks on his journey to defeat that evil. When they're, kind of doing the more mystical part, they don't refer to maybe Russia and China. I think they vaguely refer to both Iran and North Korea there. But from reading the rest of the document, it's very clear that the people that the United States and that the authors of this document do not like and want America to go after are China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then select terrorist groups, which I'm sure they throw Hezbollah into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing that comes up, I think, very heavily in the introduction is this kind of common idea that the America needs to, I guess, constantly be the most powerful nation in the world without, or it's a ability for somebody to attack us. So essentially, we need to be so powerful that we could take on everybody else at one time, or else we can't be safe. Will, do you want to address this myth a little bit?
Yeah, sure. This whole idea is actually an older one. It's actually and we'll get more into neoconservatism in a little bit here, but it's a very neoconservative idea. Right around the time of the Iraq War, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had this time where neoconservative writers and columnists were talking about a unipolar moment. Now is the time when America can seize on its dominance and really get so far ahead of our competitors that nobody could possibly compete with us. No near-peer competitors, they called it. And so this is kind of an old idea, and, the last 15 or 20 years we've seen a lot of this, they're attempting to implement it, trying to seize on, our dominant position in the world order and stuff, and try to oust rogue regimes and do stuff like this. And so this is nothing new whatsoever. This is all a very sort of neoconservative-ish, liberal hawk-ish kind of policy. So it does not mark any kind of dramatic break with the past. It's really just picking up old talking points and running with them.
Yeah, and then on top of that, what they do, and I'm guessing this is more to sell the policy to Trump, is they then say that this is what puts America first. That America being able to control what happens in Central Asia, literally on the coast of the Indian Ocean, right in Central Asia, that if we don't control that, then we're not putting America first, which is almost exactly the opposite of what candidate Trump was talking about when he was like, we don't need to be messing around this stuff. It doesn't matter how Iran feels about India. And now suddenly we have the idea that not only does America need to be so strong that we could take on all of our enemies, but that is what puts America first.
Oh, absolutely. And I think Trump did a very clear sort of bait and switch. During the campaign, the idea that you got of Trump was that he'd bring in a more of like inward-looking nationalism, fixing our roads and bridges and our infrastructure and our education and doing all this stuff, like a more inward-looking sort of Pat Buchananite nationalism. But actually, we ended up getting national greatness conservatism, which is really a neoconservative thing. That's a neocon term, national greatness. And so national greatness conservatives don't only want to make America great by rebuilding roads and bridges and stuff, but they also want our country to always be engaged in some kind of grand project abroad, like slaying the evildoers of the world. In the document, the National Security Strategy of Trump really explicitly endorses this worldview. And it sort of takes a Wilsonian bent as well, where it's claiming America is going to uplift the rest of the world as we defeat the evildoers. And so for Trump, apparently, making America great, that includes picking fights with all of our quote-unquote rivals, our rivals around the world. And he's judging by this document, he's completely bought into the terror war narrative, as well as the narratives regarding Russia and other countries. And so both of these things are just part of like the broader liberal hawk / neocon story that Trump was supposed to be rejecting. The thing that he was supposed to be disrupting. It's what he claimed to be during his campaign. But so no, this really isn't any kind of real America First strategy in the kind of like inward-looking Pat Buchanan sense. This is more just like taking the same old Washington playbook and rebranding it as, America First and nationalist.
Right. And anybody who listens to this podcast, I'm sure has the general concept that spending $700 billion on the military is not putting America first. That subsidizing the Israelis as they, just steal Palestinian land is not putting America first. Taking the side of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen's civil war isn't putting America first. Yet this is what the Trump policy calls for.
Yeah, it's terrible.
All right, so looking at this policy compared to his predecessors, because that's the one thing that is pretty consistent, is that what Trump's policy is calling for is fixing Obama's policy. So what do you think, Will, comparing the two?
I think, unfortunately, with some of this stuff, of comparing to past policies and just looking at this national security strategy, it is sort of difficult to judge some of this because it's all very vague. A lot of the proposals and the criticisms are all ambiguous, so we don't specifically know exactly what he wants to do in some of these areas. However, in general, going after terrorists, foiling terror plots, fighting crime, protecting our borders. Obama, remember, deported, I forget if it was hundreds or tens of thousands. I think it was hundreds of thousands of people that he deported. Stopping the use of weapons of mass destruction. These are all very basic policies that we've been pursuing for, not only from Obama until now, but from Bush and even before. Now, in terms of some of the differences, I guess, of Trump's strategy, which some of this is laid out in the national security strategy itself, is the references to cutting taxes and lowering regulations and debt. Which all sounds good to me, but prior Republican administrations have said this too, and we've ended up with more of those things. And so even where it tries to break with the past deliberately, it's not likely it's going to do that. And of course we have things like the modernization and the renovation of the nuclear arsenal. It's definitely a carryover from the Obama administration specifically. And so yeah, there's a lot of this stuff, even though it is vague and sort of ambiguous, most of it seems like things we've already been doing for decades.
Right. Yeah. One of the places I thought there was some real difference was Trump spent a lot of time talking about trade deals, and I think at one point even specifically mentioned the TPP. You could make cases for both. I prefer the United States is trading with all these countries. I really don't think there needs to be a huge multilateral deal to do it or whatever. But that is one difference between what Trump and Obama is calling for. As far as actual military strategy seems to go, it's hard to see a way that if with the prescription that the NSS lays out, it seems like the current foreign policy from the Obama administration could just go on. There's nothing in there that is a redirection or a change. We're not suddenly backing one country where we used to back another. It's not like we're shifting from Sunni to Shia in the Middle East or something like that.
Yeah, certainly. And like I said, in the specifics of how these policies end up playing out, we may see some minor differences, but there's no reason to think there's any like significant change in vision or in strategy or in worldview between these two administrations. It's basically Bush, Obama, Trump, you know.
Right. And Bush, Obama, Trump, there's a pretty good increase in the military spending as we go along there. So what does Trump call for in military spending?
Yeah, in the Peace Through Strength section specifically, the document amazingly asserts that the U.S. military has been cut down to a smaller size than it was in 1940. But that is not true. That is extremely misleading. It's true in a very, very narrow sense in terms of if you're counting the number of troops and ships in the Army and Navy, yes, it's true there are fewer, but that doesn't account at all for the technological improvements in military hardware and training that have happened since 1940. And so it's actually absurd to try to suggest that our military is now smaller. If you actually look at the expenditures in terms of dollars, you'll see the military has grown consistently since after World War II, since the post-World War II drawdown. However, what Trump is proposing here is to rebuild our military, which I think is kind of ironic because in 2000 we've been talking about neoconservatives here, and they sort of represent the establishment foreign policy consensus that Trump is supposed to be breaking from. But in the year 2000, a prominent neoconservative group called the Project for a New American Century, they published a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which is a phrase that could be taken directly from Trump's national security strategy. But in that paper, they called on the U.S. to, beef up its military and, launch wars and stuff, as you'd expect from neocons. So that was published in the year 2000. In the year 2000, the U.S. military or defense budget was $301 billion. In 2016, it's now $611 billion, over double what it was when the neocons were calling to rebuild our military. But yet Trump's national security strategy is still saying that we need to rebuild the military, even though it's twice the size it was when the neocons were insisting we do it in 2000. And so this is just amazing to me. It's an irony that we still have to rebuild this thing that's now twice as big as it was 15 years ago. The last time I checked, the U.S. spent more on its military than the next 7 largest countries combined. And I'm not even sure if that takes like the full accounting of U.S. military spending. They spread it out across departments to sort of minimize how it looks in the official figure. And there's actually an economist named Robert Higgs who's done a lot of work here showing how the Defense Department hides its expenditures. And one last thing I'll say here about the military part. One thing I agree with is where the strategy says that over time we've gotten less and less bang for our buck for our defense dollars. And I would say that much is actually true, but that's thanks to the established procurement procedures for military contractors like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. Those firms are basically able to charge way inflated prices for their hardware, and the Pentagon, willingly shells this out year after year. And so we probably are getting less for our defense dollar as time goes on because of these contractors. But that's also the Pentagon spending the money like there's no tomorrow too. It's not just them. It's not just the contractors.
Right. And one of the things is that the United States, they keep talking about wanting to rebuild the military, but in some sense, what are you going to rebuild? The United States just built a brand new F-35, which was the new fighter jet, and even though it sucks, according to all the neocons, it's great and brand new. We have a new class of aircraft carriers. I believe it's the Ford class, and we have the brand new USS Ronald Reagan. We have a new class of destroyers, the Zumwalt class. The new military spending for the nuclear program calls for a new class of submarines, a new class of bombers. Of course, the B-52s and the B-1Bs are still great bombers and do a whole lot of work. New Minuteman missiles. We have new missile defense systems, the THAADs. I'm trying to think. I guess we don't have new tanks, and we still use the same Black Hawk helicopters, but now we're even, developing new cruise missiles. So at some point you had to just ask, what is the United States military looking to improve on? Because it seems like, we just introduced all this new equipment. A lot of it sucks, like the Zumwalt class destroyers are breaking down all the time, but it's only because the U.S. military keeps giving contracts to the same big bloated weapons companies. And so, it seems like the problem isn't that you need to rebuild, it's just that you need to quit giving money to people who are producing crappy products. And, I think that's probably a result of the Pentagon bureaucracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the procurement procedures in place for payment. They just get paid these insane sums of money before they even produce anything. The F-35, they've been paid for this thing, and they can't really deliver.
Right. One of the big spending portions of it was they wanted to dedicate, and they said this a few times, more spending to development of missile defense systems, which I don't understand why, because it seems like it's a really hard thing to do, to shoot a missile and to hit another missile with it. But they continue to lie and say they shoot down all the missiles. I think they claim that the Patriot missiles are like 5 for 5 or 6 for 6 for shooting down Houthi missiles, and there's pretty good evidence that at least on a couple occasions that just wasn't the case. So again, it's all misleading and really confusing, because they say that they're building these great new missile systems, but they actually suck. But then we need to spend a whole bunch of more money on them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Will, we have some countries specifically addressed by name, and I figure we'll take it one or two at a time. The first two that are lumped together pretty much throughout the document. I think it's very rare that I saw anything that was a particular criticism of China and not of both China and Russia. With Russia, there were some particular criticisms with like election meddling, but even then they went and talked about China having the potential to do the same. So let's talk about the first group, Russia and China.
Sure. Yeah, and just like a little introductory note for this section, they really get into the Russia, China, and like the threat stuff in the peace through strength section of the national security strategy. And it's actually quite funny and ironic to read the first little section of the peace through strength section, because it just admits, like, on its face that this is all just a quest for power. It says, like, all throughout history, governments have quested for power. Today is no different. So it's really, it's not about American people. It's not America first. It's just a quest for power. That's what they kind of admit right in that section there. But yeah, as you say, it kind of lays out three sets of challengers: China and Russia, the rogue states of Iran and North Korea, and then jihadi groups and criminal groups.
Right, and I think the Russia and China, just to use the language of the document, are called the revisionist powers.
Yeah, exactly. And it has sort of a Manichaean quality to it, where it sort of like it makes it into a very black and white struggle of like us, good versus evil, us, those who favor freedom versus those who favor oppression. And so that's kind of the way it just like, it frames this whole issue before we get into the specifics. But overall, it basically calls for forward military deployments to counter threats in all these areas. So it's a lot of more of the same. But specifically on Russia, I think this is really unfortunate specifically for the Trump administration, because of all the stuff during his campaign about wanting to get along with Russia and all this lip service about cooperation. And things are just winding down in Syria right now. We're kind of removing some of our soldiers there. Russiagate is kind of going nowhere. And so it looked like, okay, finally there's an opening for this Russia thing to finally come to fruition. But of course now we have this national security strategy that it's completely Russophobic. And it's obviously going to be part of a major part of his foreign policy approach, is this hostility toward Russia, which is the opposite of what we thought we were getting with Trump. And so one of the things that it criticizes Russia for, it complains about the fact that Russia wants to have some kind of spheres of influence near its own borders. But I would ask, is that really such an ominous prospect that Russia wants to have spheres of influence right out near its borders? I mean, I think most countries in the world actually want that, especially like superpowers. And when you're talking about Russian spheres of influence, you also can't avoid talking about NATO. And the document humorously mentions how Russia only views NATO as a threat, not that it objectively knows NATO is, of course, a threat. This is something that American politicians really like to do, is where they point to something NATO is doing right near Russia's border, right in its sphere of influence, but then it characterizes it like Russia is being the aggressor, like Russia is conducting military operations on NATO borders, which really means within Russia's own territorial borders, but it's still NATO because it's so close now to Russia. But I would say the two main things that the document is referring to when it comes to Russian resurgence and trying to, throw around its weight in the world and get more influence, these would be the two events of Syria and Ukraine specifically, both of which we've, of course, discussed on your show before. But in Syria, of course, you have a situation where America and its allies armed and backed a jihadist rebellion. And then after 3 years of war, Russia's ally finally asked for help, and Russia relented and went there to help. But in short, this is a very direct response to our provocative policies of backing a rebellion in Syria. And so it's kind of funny how the very thing that we're pointing to as a resurgent Russia is actually provoked by us in the first place. And I would say a similar thing applies to Ukraine. And the Russian annexation of Crimea. After the Americans, we backed an anti-Russian coup in Ukraine, The new government there effectively tried to close Russia's long-standing naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea. And again, Russia responded to a provocative American policy and peacefully annexed Crimea. And so you have these two incidences of, the main things that are touted as Russian aggression and as Russian resurgence. But actually, these are precisely things that were brought about by American provocation. And then you also have a third thing that's just mentioned as like a throwaway line, is Russia's alleged invasion of Georgia. And this is mentioned in conjunction with Ukraine. But of course, Georgia was almost like Ukraine as well, where the U.S. got involved in a territorial dispute between Georgia and Russia over a region called South Ossetia. And we basically backed the Georgians after they tried to take the territory from the Russians. And then Russia's inevitable response was presented as expansionist and aggressive. And so these are basically, this is kind of just summarizing all the things America has a problem with Russia doing in the world. And all three of these things are responses directly to provocative American policies. And so I find that to just be absurd. The only examples they can come up with are things that we provoked them to do in the first place. And I think you're right about China, where pretty much everything that's mentioned about Russia, China's kind of just tacked on, minus a couple other, some specifics, like there was a reference to the South China Sea. But other than that, some reference to economic and military growth. Very few specifics are given about China. But finally, it claims that China has not liberalized, which is not true. China has, economically at least, China has vastly liberalized and improved just in the last few decades. But the strategy goes on to say that China spies on everyone and uses mass surveillance, of course, with no mention of that the fact the Americans do this stuff too. So overall, it's a very hypocritical approach to both of these countries, China and Russia.
Absolutely. And just real quick, if you look at the U.S. policy towards Russia as compared to Russia policy towards the U.S., Russia shares a border with Norway, who's a NATO member state. They share a border with Finland. I don't think Finland's a NATO member state. Oh, yes, they are a NATO member state. Then Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are all NATO member states. Poland is a NATO member state. Belarus is not. Ukraine is a country where the United States has attempted 2 coups. Georgia is a country where the United States has attempted a coup. I guess the United States, as far as I know, hasn't carried out any military action in Azerbaijan lately, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. But then on the other side of Russia, you have Japan, and then, of course, North Korea and South Korea. And Russia and North Korea also share a border where the U.S. has a lot of hostilities. So if you're Russia, the United States is involved either in an alliance or attempting to overthrow the government in 65% of your neighbors. So to take it from the Russia point of view, this is, it would seem to be almost necessarily American aggression, but yet this document really only outlines the, quote unquote Russian aggression. And it seems to me, like you said, Russia's sphere of influence really is only Russia attempting not to have coups in their neighbor states and not to have their neighbor states with the guarantee that if Russia invades, America will go to war with Russia, which is, what we have in Article 5 of NATO.
Yeah, and another thing I forgot to mention, too, of course, is all the provocative military exercises, going all around in these NATO countries, in Latvia and Poland and all these places you mentioned. And, of course, selling missile systems and other types of weapons and aid to these countries. So, yeah, Russia definitely has a good reason to see NATO and NATO allies as a threat. And not only view it as one, it objectively is one, if you're Russia.
Yeah, I mean, not too far off of Russia's border, we have the U.S. base in Japan with the aircraft carrier there. So we have at least one aircraft carrier strike group at all times in the Pacific, right on Russia's, what would that be, eastern border, as well as the B-1B bombers in Guam. And then on the other side, we're constantly operating in both the Black and Baltic Sea as well. So if you look at who's completely surrounded by the other, Russia may be a big country, but they are certainly very surrounded. As far as China goes, I mean, the United States is talking about trying to, meddle in the South China Sea. And it seems to me, the smart move would just be to let the neighbors work out their differences there. That way there could be some sort of regional stability in the long run. Because, of course, if the United States forces a policy on China, that's a bad deal for China. And then one day the United States is either maybe in a weaker military position or no longer cares about that point of the world, then China would look to reassert itself and, kind of have almost a market correction situation there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think it's funny that the main criticism, I guess not the main criticism, but the existential threat that these two countries provide, according to this document, is something that just seems odd to me. Because really the only thing that Russia and China you could even accuse of doing is sometimes wanting to do things on their own. China wants to go invest in Africa on their own. Russia wants to have some non-U.S. allies on their border. But there's really all they're doing is just dissenting to the American view of the world, which you can't impose the American view on the entire world. But that's been the policy ever since at least the second Bush became president.
Yeah, exactly. And these things, these acts of like just simple independent acts of wanting to do things on their own as sovereign nations are presented not only by Trump in general, but specifically by this national security strategy as sort of like mischievous like behavior around the world, trying to undermine our world order just because they're trying to do things on their own. It's quite absurd.
Right. And so now we kind of covered the revisionist powers. Let's look at the rogue states, and these are outlined as Iran and North Korea.
Sure, yeah. So first, of course, the boilerplate, the common refrain about Iran is the world's largest supporter of terrorism, which, as we've disabused your audience many times on the show, is not Iran. It's more likely the Gulf Sheikdoms in Saudi Arabia. But when it says Iran is supporting terrorism around the world, it's obviously referring to Hezbollah. And it's quite ironic because Hezbollah itself has been fighting groups like the Islamic State for years now, specifically in Syria, but elsewhere as well. And so there's something wrong with this narrative when they're being presented as the greatest supporter of terrorism, but the groups they support are fighting the Islamic State, the worst terror group, I think we can all agree, in the world. And so, as far as the talk of Iran and the regional stability goes, it completely ignores America's role in creating that whole situation in the first place. Not solely, but largely through our invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so, as I was explaining for Russia, you'll notice a similar pattern with Iran. That any kind of like rise in Iranian influence or resurgence you see in the region is almost completely due to or as a response to American policies, that we basically invited this. And so in light of that context, presenting these, not only Iran, but Russia as well, presenting these as dire threats is preposterous. If we would just stop doing these ridiculous things we're doing in the world, we would stop inviting these countries to take advantage of our errors. And so in terms of Iran, there's not a lot of specific. It's just we have to combat their extremist ideology and the fact that they back terrorists. Now, in terms of North Korea, they're also painted as an aggressive expansionist power. But I would say that's clearly not true. I mean, just ask yourself, when was the last time North Korea launched an aggressive war or invaded anybody or crossed anybody's borders or actually attacked anybody? Missile tests are one thing, but every civilized country on planet Earth conducts missile tests. I'm talking about actual invasions. And the same thing could pretty much be asked for all these countries, Russia and China and Iran, all three of these. When was the last time they actually invaded another country? And of course I'm not enthusiastic about the idea of a nuclear-capable North Korea with an ICBM or whatever. But I also recognize that North Korea, like Russia, feels completely threatened by the United States. And until an American administration can take this into account prior to negotiating, that the North Koreans are not threatening, but they feel threatened, that they're not, like their whole calculus is based on their perception of a threat. Until an administration is willing to do that, it doesn't seem like the current hostile policy couldn't possibly produce results. And of course, that's the type of policy that's endorsed by the national security strategy. It's just more like, more like assisting Japan and South Korea with missile defense and more hostility and more bluster, basically.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this one of the first things you said, and that is they kind of claim that Iran and North Korea are the state sponsors of terror, and I believe both countries are now back on that list, which seems insane to me that the two countries that you would single out of pretty much any country is Iran and North Korea. The people I could guarantee you that have never gave weapons to ISIS is the Iranians. The United States has. Turkey allowed them to use their country and their borders to export their oil and import their fighters. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE gave them weapons. And yet you point the finger at Iran, who's done nothing, as you said, but fight ISIS and call them state sponsors of terror. Again, you could point to all these countries directly arming and helping the terror groups, and yet North Korea is the other country singled out for doing it. just seems absurd and ridiculous that, that these two countries would be the ones that the NSS singles out.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The other issue I have with it is just how it kind of conflates the Iranian missile program with the North Korean nuclear program. They're like, Iran is developing the missiles and North Korea is developing the nuclear bombs. Like, somehow this is a dual threat, I guess. Remember, Iran's missiles cannot in any way, maybe even reach Europe, but definitely not reach the United States. Unless there's U.S. soldiers in the Middle East and around Iran, there's no threat to the United States from the Iranian missiles. And also, this document, I think it's worth noting, completely dismisses the pretense that Iran is even working towards nuclear weapons or that Iran is in any way a nuclear threat, which from the neocon worldview should be a huge gain. And they never bring it up because this was like the existential threat to the United States was Iran's nuclear weapons program, which now apparently doesn't exist because nobody, is talking about it, and yet they pretend like it's still a big threat, I guess.
Right, exactly. And at the same time, Trump, of course, wants to torpedo the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, which is like the best possible thing for ensuring Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. But that's maybe another issue to discuss.
Right, and then you touched on this a little bit, but the idea that North Korea wants to export anything, they're pretty isolated, and that seems to be their policy. They rarely let their own citizens leave the country, I guess in part because they're worried that once somebody leaves, they won't come back.
Yeah, definitely.
But it doesn't seem like, again, Iran, as you point out, like Russia, isn't necessarily looking to expand. Maybe they've taken advantage of some strategic situations created by the United States. I mean, the United States invited Iran into Baghdad, not, Iran didn't force their way in. So, a lot of the expansion is at the fault of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of North Korea, I mean, come on, they don't even have electricity. They can barely even feed their population. There's, they don't have markets. I don't know how they're supposed to be, what terrorist groups wants that as a sponsor? Who wants to be sponsored by North Korea anyway?
Right. And so the only other thing I have to say is, kind of like Russia and China, the only thing that these states are really guilty of is giving the U.S. the middle finger. They're guilty of other things, but as far as, as slights to the United States or have done actually anything to the United States, it's just saying that we're not going to bend to your will. Because the North Koreans haven't, attacked the United States, at least not in, 50-something years now?
Yeah.
Same with the Iranians, not since the hostage situation. So, and since then, you've had the United States backing Iran in several situations. So, there's really no reason for the United States to have a hawkish foreign policy against these countries.
Yeah, it's just very, with both, just to summarize real quick, on the Russia, China, and Iran and North Korea, it just demonstrates a profound confusion about history and about how things have unfolded in this world. It's really, I didn't expect any better. This is what every administration does. They have this very selective worldview that completely truncates all the important history and only, focuses on selective things. But that's definitely what the conclusion to draw from these two sections.
Okay, well, and then Group C we have is terrorists. So talk a little bit about Trump's terrorism policy.
Yeah, sure. So I think largely what we can conclude from the strategy is that we're pretty much going to be waging the war on terror in a very similar way for a long time. We'll probably be doing a lot of the same, just more of it. More drones, more. You might see slight strategic shifts, in Afghanistan. They're looking to sort of alter the policy there a little bit, but no fundamental reconsiderations of the policy itself. So a lot of this I think is going to be the same. And it's really disappointing in this document because it often recognizes the foreign policy blunders of the last few decades, especially as it relates to the ongoing war on terror and all the conflicts in that. The national security strategy does kind of say, we've made these mistakes here and there, and that kind of echoes Trump's campaign rhetoric, but it draws every single wrong conclusion that you could draw from this. And it takes it for granted that these wars are good wars that should be fought. It's just we have to do it more aggressively, as if that's been the problem all along. Is we've been too careful about it. And I think this kind of goes along with the talking point that, leaving Iraq caused the rise of the Islamic State. I think this administration is kind of taking that as a lesson that you can't ever leave anywhere or else whatever bad happens there is your fault. And so you have to go back and stay forever. But in terms of terrorists, I think we can expect a lot more of the same in this.
Absolutely. And the only thing I really had a note otherwise is just that they reasserted several times that they are going to chase the terrorist threat anywhere and everywhere. So it does seem that they are, kind of all hands off on if they're allowed to bomb in a country, they're going to do it. Not by the U.S. Congress. I'm guessing, going to use the AUMF of 2001 to do it.
Yeah, and the words they use for this is they will pursue threats to their source, is what they're talking about. And because they say our enemies, quote, thrive under conditions of state weakness and prey on the vulnerable as they accelerate the breakdown of rules and create havens to which they can plan attacks and launch them. But I would say it's pretty ironic because in the Middle East, more than anywhere, and more than anybody else either, the United States has created these havens or, bad security situations. And we covered this in depth when we talked about the rise of the Islamic State and how the American invasion of Iraq created the ideal conditions for al-Qaeda in Iraq and militants like Zarqawi. And sometimes when we create these havens or these bad security situations in our very attempts to pursue threats. And so in much of Afghanistan, you have this hostile war zone that's not really safe for anybody. And this isn't despite our efforts, but it's because of them. It's because of the fact we're occupying that we now have a safe haven or we now have a bad security situation. And so it's funny how, they're presenting this like it's a new proposal. We're going to pursue threats to their source. But really, this is what we've been doing all along, and it's part of the problem. It's part of the whole problem in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that's often the case that, we are creating blowback and then expanding the war to another region because the terrorists, even if we bomb them out of Afghanistan, they just go to Pakistan and we bomb there and then they end up somewhere else. And so we bomb there. And so, this is really, at this point, maybe the war started in Afghanistan, it spread all the way to the Philippines and all the way to at least Nigeria, right? And so if you look at what the United States has done, it's just created so many more enemies.
And it's exactly as Osama bin Laden said as well, that, all I have to do is send a couple guys with a piece of cloth that says Al-Qaeda on it to any corner of the globe, and I'll get the Americans to follow me there. And so this whole pursuit, threats to their source is just like doing bin Laden's bidding completely.
All right. Well, so there are some policies called for, especially related to foreign policy, that we haven't really addressed so far, even though I think we've covered a good chunk of what the law and document talks about. Obviously, there's a lot in there that we're not able to cover, but maybe what are a few more important things that everybody should know about this?
Sure. And as I've kind of been saying too, a lot of this is sort of like boilerplate language that it's not extremely specific. It's kind of like we will work to shore up our allies, or we will stop our rivals from undermining democracy. And so a lot of that, it's hard to even gauge what that means. However, you do have some specific proposals like greater resources to disrupting terror plots, for example, like domestic terrorist plots, which is sort of different from, it's more of a law enforcement than a foreign policy issue. And we already kind of know how this goes. We have at least a dozen or so known cases of FBI or other law enforcement agencies entrapping the mentally ill or the socially awkward or whatever. And they're lured into phony terror plots where, the FBI will foil it and then the media presents it as some great victory for law enforcement. And so in that department, I think we can expect more of that, more phony terror plots, trying to make our law enforcement look good. And another very significant thing that I think is almost maybe even the most important part of the document is, in addition to sort of pursuing threats, as they say, the strategy also proposes more sort of like reform and training and security work abroad. And so that basically just means more American meddling in foreign politics. And so you have agencies like the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy and U.S. aid that, push for reform in certain countries, but this itself can be a destabilizing force. Almost in some cases more so than an outright military intervention. And you sort of see a combination of this stuff happening on the African continent. The great work of Nick Terse, a journalist who covers American military involvement in Africa. We see all kinds of stuff. We see diplomatic meddling, pushes for reforms, pushes for economic reforms. And then we also see, military train and assist programs. And so according to this strategy, it seems like we're going to be doing more of that, not only in Africa, but in, Central Asia and in a bunch of other countries. And so it's sort of like soft interventionism, I guess you would call it.
Right. I wanted to go back to the thing because I had a similar note about, I think the policy prescription was combat radicalization and recruitment in communities. Yeah. And this likely means entrapping more people. what Will talked about is that the FBI will essentially harass people and try to get them to eventually give support to one of these terrorist groups. One of the more recent stories is one of the most absurd ones I have heard. It's a white guy, it's a cop, who from 2010 to 2016 was, I guess, asked by FBI informants, to provide some sort of support to terrorism through all this time. The guy was doing it not because he was a jihadist, but because he was a Nazi who forming some kind of alliance with ISIS, because in his view, the main problem in the world was the Jews. Which obviously, if you look at what ISIS did, one of the things they haven't done is attacked Israel. They've attacked Iran and Russia far more than they've attacked Israel. So obviously this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But anyways, this is a guy who the FBI now has on, charges of supporting terrorism because he bought like $100 gift card, for, I believe ISIS people so they could listen to ISIS podcasts or something. It was like a Google Play card that this guy bought for ISIS, and that this is the big threat, and that this is what America needs to combat, is the most ridiculous thing ever. These are harmless people who only after the constant nagging of FBI informants are barely able to cobble together the most pathetic plots ever. And these are supposed to be the people we should fear the most.
Yeah, definitely.
Another pretty heavy point is talking about either cybersecurity or data intelligence. And I thought this was kind of weird. At one point, the document suggests that the terrorists are a threat to your thermostat. Because I guess now people have these $400 thermostats that you could connect to your iPhone and to your TV or whatever ridiculous things that people want to do today with their thermostats, and that the terrorists would possibly hack one of these, and that this is some kind of threat to the United States, was one of the most ridiculous claims in the entire document. But it goes to show how afraid that they think people are today, that they could possibly pull off a lie like this.
I find it funny. I think it's humorous to think about the thermostat, but no, it's not. It's really not funny. They're trying to scare people. This whole document is full of this fear-mongering language about, you need this giant state to be killing people overseas to keep you safe and make you feel better. It's what a lot of this document tries to do in terms of its public outreach.
Another thing that he calls for several times is government spending more money on digital security. This is one thing I have a problem with it, because it seems to me that the most likely, people to be hacked are these large companies. And so essentially the government is just becoming the digital security guards of the world. And I'm sure this is a huge subsidy to ISPs and companies like Amazon, who no longer had to provide their own cybersecurity, or at least not to as much of an extent, because the government is tasking themselves with doing it.
Yeah, sure. And in terms of cyber, there's a really annoying line in here that says, quote, security was not a major consideration when the internet was designed and launched. And as it, blah, 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 as it evolves, the government and the private sector must fix this. But this is really a preposterous claim, because the NSA itself, through its surveillance practices, through its invasive practices, actually undermines the security of the entire internet itself. And so for this document to talk about how, security hasn't always been a consideration for the internet, in the private sector it has. Private companies have always been concerned about internet, cybersecurity. It's the groups like the NSA that are completely undermining that in an infrastructure level. Not even just the whole thing is being affected by how the NSA operates. So I found that to be kind of preposterous they're concerned about cybersecurity as they completely undermine it for the whole world.
Right. Another point in here that I thought was a standard one of they're going to cut waste, fraud, and abuse to get this stuff done. Obviously, that everybody in every government position ever says that, and not a single one actually does it. I thought it was noting that at several points he talked about going after the drug traffickers, and I don't think he was just talking about the drug traffickers in Afghanistan, of course, the Taliban, but the ones in Mexico as well. So I'm wondering what kind of force that Trump is going to authorize to go after those guys.
Yeah, definitely. If that were made into which prior administrations have tried to do, for example, in Colombia and stuff, combating cultivation of cocaine or cocaine crops, this becomes a foreign policy instead of a law enforcement issue. That could be a problem. But related to drug use and stuff, I guess I should bring this up now. It'd be relevant. It makes reference to the opioid epidemic, and it talks about how these drug dealers are selling drugs to our children and stuff. But it makes no reference whatsoever to the FDA-approved prescription opioids like oxycodone and hydrocodone and Dilaudid and fentanyl. It makes no reference to these, when in fact these pharmaceuticals actually kill far more people than illicit narcotics do, like heroin. And so, of course, for the administration, the solution for this kind of thing, for the drug enforcement thing, is always going to be more law enforcement and more treatment options. Whereas I think you and I would both agree that the problem really is the prohibition of narcotics in the first place. You end up with these violent black markets where every kind of, antisocial behavior is encouraged and incentivized. We don't end up with a drug-free society when we pursue this, drug war. We end up with worse drug abuse, with more people overdosing, with worse, problems in this regard.
Yeah, and me and Brian Sadie covered that on my last podcast. We talked about the drug war and Mexico. So if anybody wants to listen to that, you could go back and listen to Foreign Policy Focus 133. The other thing I thought was interesting, at one point he refers to sanctions as economic diplomacy.
Yeah. That's insane. And it's funny, in another part of the document, he criticizes China for throwing around its weight and putting sanctions on countries to do its bidding. But, for us, it's just economic diplomacy.
And then the last one I want to talk about, and this wasn't talked about much, but it did seem concerning, and they want to prevent China from acting on data. And they're not talking about data like hacked intelligence or something like that, but just general data like what people like to buy and shop for, and, the stuff that Facebook or Google sells, right? And, why do we care, I guess, if Alibaba is using, data to send me better advertisements, then is that at all a threat to national security, Will?
I don't think so. I like Alibaba. I like both. I like Amazon and Alibaba. But, no, and it's very hypocritical, too, to talk about this in terms of, I know you're talking more about, commercial data, but in terms of state surveillance, come on, the NSA spies on everybody. And not just the NSA. We got 15 more intelligence agencies. And so if you're going to refer to, collection of data and surveillance and stuff, it's so hypocritical. How can you even say this with a straight face?
Absolutely. So one of the last things I want to touch on, Will, is just there's a whole bunch of random lies in these documents. And I know we don't have time to go through all of them, but is there maybe one that you thought was either the worst or the funniest or, just want to talk about and debunk?
Yeah. Fortunately, we've kind of covered a couple of them, like the thing about the opioid crisis. That was kind of a random point that I found interesting. But there's one quote in there that I guess that we could focus on that I think is important. So it says, today, the actors such as Russia are using information tools in an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of democracies. And we know what that's talking about the most recent election. So it's endorsing the counter narrative against its own administration. But it says, continuing the quote, it says, adversaries target media, political processes, financial networks, and personal data. And I guess this kind of touches on what we were just talking about in regards to China. But the U.S. government does every single one of these things more than anybody else in the world. And so I guess it's just funny to see the absolute hypocrisy here. How the absolute selective presentation of information. Where if you know a couple details about this stuff, well, hey, the United States does this more than all these countries combined, probably. And in terms of putting out information tools, media stuff. Earlier in this very document, they explicitly state how they intend to counter jihadist ideology, which presumably means by targeting foreign media with propaganda, which we've already been doing anyway. But it's just funny how, almost in the same breath, it'll criticize Russia for, getting into other countries' media, but then it explicitly endorses the very same thing as a policy of us. So I don't know, maybe that was a good random throwaway line.
Yeah, and then the one I picked out was, the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons against its own citizens undermines international norms against these hideous weapons, which may encourage more actors to pursue and use them. Obviously, my main problem with it is that the Syrian government didn't use chemical weapons against their own civilians. Of course, Will Porter has debunked this on this very show, and I will go ahead and link to that episode in the show notes. But just to go over it, the United States under Obama drew a red line saying that if chemical weapons were used in Syria, the United States would get involved. Al-Qaeda took this as an opportunity to attempt to get the United States to overthrow Assad for them. It didn't work out because Putin pulled back and took Assad's chemical weapons to prove that Assad would not be using chemical weapons against his own people. That really didn't stop the terrorists from trying again, with at least one case where I saw some videos claiming that barrel bombs were used to drop chemical weapons. It doesn't look like those reports are true. And then there was the attack in Khan Sheikhoun on April 4th of this year, which of course was falsely claimed to be a chemical weapons attack by the Syrian government. And again, I'll link to the episode where me and Will discuss, and debunk that claim.
Yeah, indeed. That was one that I had thought of too. And I have one more real quick to throw in here.
Absolutely.
The NSS, it mentions pandemic threats and how we have to be careful and watch out for these. But of course, it makes no mention of cholera in Yemen right now, which is a real bad bacterial infection that's infected nearly 1 million people now. So no mention of that, of course. But yeah, we gotta be careful of those pandemic threats.
All right. Well, let's do overall thoughts. What did you take away from this document?
Yeah, sure. So one thing I would suggest your audience can go along with this. Go to the PDF, download this national security strategy, and type in the word freedom in the search bar. And then type in the words security or strength. And I think that is a great summary of what this thing's all about. You'll find a couple references to freedom, that's true, a couple throwaway lines, but you'll find tons, dozens of references to security and strength and power and force in the military. And so that's really what this is all about. It pays some lip service to liberty, but it has nothing to do with that. This thing's really a revolting document when you look at it for its purely foreign policy aspects. Overall, it's trying to scare you. It's trying to tell you how terrible and dangerous and horrifying the world is, and how you need our state to go kill people overseas to make you feel better. And so I think it's bad, but it's not new. There's not a lot of new stuff we're finding in here. And I don't think any single thing is completely new. This is all just variations on a theme. You might have slight novelties, but nothing is completely new. So Trump's differences with the establishment here are completely cosmetic and personal. But ideologically and policy-wise, this guy's as bad as a Clinton or a Bush, I think.
Well, I absolutely agree with that last part, that he's as bad as a Bush or a Clinton, and probably not much different in his foreign policy. One of the things, I guess, that I took away from it was just this general idea that there's a force for good in the world, and that's America and our allies, and then there's these bad people like Russia and China who try to make things worse, and then the ultimate evil of Iran and North Korea who are trying to destroy the world order. And America is the country anointed with the, ancient, power or authority to attack and defeat the evildoers. And I think that's a really, really dangerous idea to have, because that means America could go anywhere and do anything. Another interesting omission I found was very little reference to the Israel-Palestine situation. No real policy prescriptions on how he's going to handle that situation, even though he made a huge move on it in the weeks before this coming out. So I thought that was worth noting.
Yeah, can I cut in real quick here about Israel?
Yeah,
there's one thing I missed. There was an amazing assertion here about Iran, pertaining to Iran and Israel. And it basically says that, none of the trouble in the region is Israel's fault. It's saying that, now that we've seen some of these other terror groups, now we see that none of this is really Israel's fault. And the whole peace process with the Palestinians, this isn't, Israel's not to be blamed. It's all the terrorist Iran axis who's destabilizing everything. But I guess we just ignore people like, Osama bin Laden and other militants who've said that this is what motivates him. So I found that to be a, insane omission of fact.
All right. What do you think are the implications or the impacts of this of this NSS? Does it change anything as far as it goes, day to day in the Middle East with America's foreign policy? Are we doing things differently, the same? What's up?
No, I don't think it represents any kind of drastic or significant change from prior policies. You might see some escalations and some de-escalations in certain little areas piecemeal. But generally, it sounds like Trump has bought into the whole Washington playbook, the whole liberal international order that he's now the champion of. And again, he was supposed to be the disruptor of that, but it seems that that's completely, that's not in the cards. And so it seems that some segments of the American population really do want restraint, man. They really do want this stuff to end. That's why they elected Obama, and I think that's why some proportion of the electorate voted for Trump, is because they want restraint. They want some kind of drawback of this. But we're not getting that. We didn't get it with Obama, the Nobel Prize winning bomber, and I don't think we're going to get it from Trump. I don't know what to call him, but.
Yeah. So that was one that I was going to agree with your impacts and implications. Absolutely. The last thing we were going to talk about is anything good. And all I was going to say is that at least a part of this document had to be framed in our language. The America First idea, at least the campaign idea that rallied people, was that we weren't going to go around fighting other people's wars anymore. We're not going to, do Europe's bidding to combat Russia, and we're not going to, fight these pointless wars in the Middle East. But the rest of the document says we're going to do that, but at least they have to kind of phrase it in that language. And then, the idea of peace through strength, that the ultimate idea is peace, is, of course, our policy as well. So, Will, did you find anything good in the document?
Yeah, I would agree with you with that. That like he's sort of been hemmed in to frame the issue in a certain way in terms of how this is supposed to benefit you, how this is supposed to be America first, and how this is supposed to achieve peace. So yeah, that's all good sort of lip service stuff, and it's good that he's forced to even make that to even frame it that way. But otherwise, no, I don't know of any like overall broad good things to draw from this. A couple good things are the recognition of how military contractors and the procurement process, there's a lot of problems there. That's certainly true. I guess I could get behind reform of that, although it probably won't be toward anything good, just that specific little issue, though. I guess that's a good thing. Less money in the pocket of Lockheed. And then, of course, there's some lip service that's paid to free trade and private solutions and private alternatives and stuff, which is a good, refreshing thing from the typical progressive, the government should do everything kind of line. Now, in Trump's case, and in the case of most Republicans, this usually means some kind of horrible form of cronyism and corporatism, I guess you'd say. But still, I guess the lip service to it, if we're really looking for something good, I'd say that would be it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for breaking down this document with me. I hope we saved a lot of you a lot of reading and time, and you don't have to go through this horrendous document and read it yourself. So listen to the show. I hope you all enjoy it. Will, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at WKP&CAP, ANCAP. You can find some of my freelance work at the Libertarian Institute. You'll find me in the featured articles and in the blog sections, at antiwar.com in the viewpoint section. I had a lot of my prior work published at a site called The Daily Sheeple, a lot of news coverage and commentary and stuff there. And otherwise, you can find me in the Kyle's podcast Facebook group, which I think he'll tell you about.
Right, and for those of you who would like to take the time to share this show, which I really hope you do, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, on Facebook, the Libertarian Union, Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus, so you can request to join and talk about foreign policy in there with me, Will, and a bunch of other guys. And then my personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle.